"That horse will break his neck before sundown," somebody said from the rail, and no one in the yard laughed. Wyatt Kane sat loose in the saddle as the bay stallion pitched beneath him, dust kicking up around the corral boards, his hat gone, one sleeve torn at the cuff, his face calm in a way that made men uneasy. The horse was not mean. Clara Bennett could see that from where she stood beside the water trough with a feed bucket against her hip. It was scared, crowded, tired of hands grabbing at its mouth, and every man watching had already decided it was only wild. Wyatt did not spur it harder. He did not shout. When the animal lunged toward the fence, he leaned low, took the pull with his whole body, and guided it away from the rails before it could hurt itself. That was the part Clara noticed. Not the risk. Not the dust. The care. Men in Dry Creek had stories about Wyatt Cain. He rode broncs other men refused, crossed flooded washes for lost cattle, slept in barns when he had coin enough for a bed, and left every town before anybody could start expecting him at supper. Mothers warned daughters about him with lowered voices. Ranchers hired him when the work was dangerous and complained when he would not stay. No one called him cruel. That would have been easier to understand. They called him reckless, which meant they could admire him from a safe distance and still shake their heads when he passed. Clara had learned something about safe distances. 3 weeks earlier, she had stood on the church steps in a blue dress she had mended twice at the hem while Edward Pike told her, in front of half the town, that he could not marry a woman who brought more debt than land. He had said it quietly enough to pretend mercy and loudly enough for everyone to hear. Since then, people spoke softer around her, which was worse than laughter. Her father's small ranch sat 2 miles east, with a sagging barn door, 12 good hens, 1 milk cow, and a kitchen table with 3 chairs though only 2 were used. Her younger brother, Samuel, still set out the third by habit some mornings, then put it back before she saw. She always saw. In the corral, the stallion finally stopped fighting. Wyatt slid down slow and stepped away before touching its neck. He gave the horse room first. That, too, Clara noticed. A hired hand opened the gate too soon. The bay bolted, shoulder catching the latch, and the whole gate swung hard toward Clara. The feed bucket dropped from her hands. Grain scattered across the dirt. Wyatt moved before anyone called out. He caught the gate with both hands, boots skidding, the wood stopping a foot from her side. For a moment, all she heard was the horse breathing and grain ticking softly against the trough. Wyatt looked at the broken latch, then at the bucket on the ground. He bent, gathered it up, and handed it back to her without making a scene of it. His knuckles were scraped. His voice stayed low. "Latch is worn through." Then he took a bent nail from the fence post, worked it straight against the rail, and fixed the gate well enough to hold until sundown. Clara stood with the bucket in both hands and watched the man nobody could tame step back from the repaired latch as if he had done nothing worth mentioning. Clara carried the feed bucket back across the yard with both hands, though it was nearly empty by then. She did not thank Wyatt again. He had not waited for it. He was already at the far rail, checking the stallion's left foreleg with the careful distance of a man who knew a frightened animal needed space more than comfort. The others had gone back to talking. Men did that after danger passed. They turned it into noise. Clara went quiet instead. She crossed the road before anyone could ask if she was all right and walked the 2 miles home with dust on the hem of her dress and grain still caught in the cuff of one sleeve. The Bennett place looked smaller in the late light. The barn door leaned where the wind had worried it all spring. The porch step had a soft place near the right corner. A line of wash moved lazily between 2 posts, and Samuel was standing on a crate to reach the clothespins, his shirt sleeves rolled past his elbows as if that made him older than 12. He climbed down when he saw her. He looked at the dust first, then her face. Clara set the bucket by the coop and told him the hens had already been fed at the Haskins place by mistake, which was not true, but it gave him something ordinary to believe for one more evening. Supper was potatoes fried in bacon grease saved from Sunday, beans warmed slow, and coffee stretched thinner than either of them liked. Samuel set 2 plates on the table, paused, then reached for the third. His hand stopped over it. Clara turned back to the stove and gave him time to put it away. Outside, a horse passed on the road, then kept going. She did not look through the window. After supper, Samuel took the milk pail out, and Clara sat alone at the table with her mending. Edward Pike's last letter was still in the drawer beneath the flour sack, not because she wanted it, but because paper had use on the frontier. She had torn the clean edges off it twice already to twist around seed packets. The words in the middle remained. More debt than land. She threaded a needle and worked by lamplight until the stitches blurred. Near dark, the cow bawled once from the pen. Samuel came in carrying the pail only half full. The lower hinge on the small gate had given way again, and the cow had pushed through before he could latch it. Clara rose without complaint. She found the hammer, took the lantern, and went out. The hinge was worse than she remembered. One screw gone, the wood split around another, the whole thing hanging tired. She held the lantern close and studied it the way her father would have, not wishing it better, only taking its measure. Then she saw the bent nail driven clean through the latch plate. New. Straightened by hand. Set firm enough to hold through the night. Beside the post lay the broken screw, removed and placed where she would find it. No note. No boot prints that stayed clear in the packed dirt. Samuel came up behind her and looked at the gate. Somebody fixed it. Clara touched the nail with one finger. It was the same size as the one Wyatt had pulled from the corral fence. She stood there in the lantern light, the tired cow breathing behind her, her brother waiting for an answer she did not have, and for the first time in 3 weeks the place did not feel quite as left behind. By morning, Clara had taken the broken screw to the kitchen table and set it beside the coffee tin. She did not know why. It was only a screw, rusted thin at the head, something any practical man would have thrown into a nail keg and forgotten. Still, she left it there while she mixed cornmeal, while Samuel carried water from the pump, while the sun lifted pale over the east pasture and showed all the work waiting where night had kindly hidden it. The barn roof had lost 2 shingles. The south fence sagged in 3 places. The cow gate held. That was the first thing Samuel checked before breakfast, and when he came back in, he did not say Wyatt's name. Neither did Clara. Trust was not a thing to speak too early. It had to stand in weather first. Near noon, she hitched their old mare to the wagon and drove into Dry Creek with eggs wrapped in cloth and 3 jars of preserve she had hoped to keep until winter. The general store smelled of coffee, leather, and rain coming. Mrs. Alden counted the eggs twice and paid less than Clara had expected. She did not argue. Arguing over pennies cost more pride than it earned. On her way out, 2 women stopped talking just long enough to make their silence useful. Edward Pike stood by the seed bins with his new bride's brother, one hand tucked in his vest, looking at Clara as if she were a poor decision he had been lucky to escape. Clara kept walking. Outside, the sky had turned low and gray. She loaded the flour sack, checked the harness, and saw Wyatt across the street at the livery, tightening a cinch on the bay stallion. The horse tossed its head once, then stilled when Wyatt rested a hand on its neck and waited. He did not force calm into the animal. He gave it time to find some. Clara looked away first. She climbed to the wagon seat and took up the reins. 3 miles out, rain began hard enough to turn the road slick. The front wheel dropped into a rut near Miller's Wash, and the wagon lurched sideways. Flour slid. A jar cracked. The mare strained and stopped, trembling. Clara climbed down into ankle-deep mud and put her shoulder to the wheel because there was no one else there to do it. The wheel did not move. She tried again. Mud soaked the hem of her dress. The mare blew hard through her nose. Then another horse came up behind her, quiet despite the rain. Wyatt dismounted without a word, took off his coat, and laid it over the flour sack before the water reached it. He stepped into the rut, set both hands to the wheel, and waited for Clara to take the reins. She did. On his nod, she urged the mare forward. He lifted. The wheel came free with a wet pull. No speech. No fuss. He checked the axle, tightened a loose trace, then picked up the cracked preserve jar from the wagon bed. Peaches had leaked into the straw. He set the jar upright anyway, saving what was left. Clara stood in the rain with the reins in her hands and watched him do that small, unnecessary thing. When he was done, he swung back onto the bay and turned toward town. The stallion resisted for one breath, looking toward Clara's wagon. Wyatt let it look. Then he rode on, slower than before, keeping close enough behind her all the way to the Bennett gate that the road did not feel quite so empty. The rain passed before morning, leaving the yard silver with puddles and the fence posts dark at the base. Clara found Wyatt's coat folded over the porch rail just after sunrise, clean enough to mean he had stopped somewhere in the night to shake the mud from it before leaving it there. The flour sack beneath it had stayed dry. That mattered more than the coat. Samuel saw it too and said nothing, but he carried the sack inside with both arms as if it were something important. By noon, the story had reached Dry Creek ahead of her. It always did. A wagon pulled free became a rescue. A man riding behind her became something else entirely. At the mercantile, Mrs. Alden tied Clara's parcel with twine and kept her eyes too carefully on the counter. Near the stove, two ranch hands spoke Wyatt's name in the lowered tone people used for weather that might turn. Clara bought lamp oil, salt, and a small packet of buttons. She counted the coins twice. Behind her, Edward Pike said a man like Cain helped women the same way he broke horses, quick and hard, then moved on when the challenge was over. Clara felt the words settle at the back of her neck. She did not answer. Outside, the bay stallion stood tied at the livery rail, wet mane combed smooth, one ear turned toward the street. Wyatt was not there. The horse watched Clara with a stillness that did not match the stories told about it. She stepped around the mud in the road and held out one hand, not touching, only letting the animal decide the distance. The stallion breathed once against her palm and did not pull away. Across the street, conversation thinned. Clara lowered her hand and went to her wagon. She had learned not to give the town more than it had already taken. That evening, Wyatt came by the Bennett place while there was still light enough to work. He did not come to the door first. He went to the south fence, set a coil of wire on the ground, and started replacing the sagging stretch that had leaned since spring. Samuel went out after a while and stood a few yards away, watching. Wyatt handed him the fence pliers without instruction, then showed him with his own hands how to pull the wire true without snapping it. Clara watched from the kitchen window with bread dough under a cloth and coffee cooling beside the stove. Work before words. That was a language the house understood. When the fence held straight, Wyatt walked to the porch and set the pliers on the step. Clara came out with a tin cup of coffee because there was no honest way to pretend she had not been watching. He took it with a nod, drank half, and set the cup back carefully where it would not tip. Samuel asked if the bay had a name. Wyatt looked toward the road where the horse waited loose-reined and patient. Not one that stuck. Samuel considered that with the seriousness of boys who believe naming a thing gives it a place. Clara looked at the horse, then at the repaired fence, then at Wyatt's scraped hands resting easy at his sides. The town had warned her about a man who never stayed, but warning and witnessing were not the same thing. After that evening, Wyatt did not become a visitor. Visitors knocked, sat, and made a house rearrange itself around them. Wyatt came the way weather came, plain and useful, arriving near the edge of daylight with his sleeves rolled and leaving before the kitchen lamp burned low. On Monday, he brought 2 spare hinges from the Haskins scrap pile and reset the barn door so it closed without Clara lifting it with her shoulder. On Tuesday, he sharpened the axe because Samuel had been trying to split kindling with a dull blade and too much pride. On Wednesday, He fixed the loose board on the porch step and said nothing when Clara came outside with a broom and found the work already done. She did not thank him every time. That would have made each kindness stand alone, and they had begun to gather into something steadier than that. She answered with work. She washed and patched the tear in his coat cuff where the corral rail had caught it. She set coffee on the porch rail when he was mending fence. She packed yesterday's biscuits in a cloth and gave them to Samuel to carry out, as if the boy had thought of it himself. Wyatt accepted them the same way he gave help, without display, but the next morning the cloth came back folded square and clean. The bay stallion began appearing with him, always tied loose near the cottonwood by the road. It still tossed its head when men passed too close, still stamped at sudden sounds, still watched the world as if the world might grab first. Clara understood that more than she cared to. One afternoon, while Wyatt and Samuel worked at the pump handle, the bay stepped close to the kitchen garden and lowered its nose toward the bean vines. Clara came out with carrot peelings in her apron. She stopped 6 feet away and waited. The horse stretched its neck. She held out one peeling on her flat palm. It took the offering with careful lips, then stood there breathing warm against her wrist. Wyatt saw from the pump but did not call out. He let the quiet hold. Samuel noticed too, and his face changed in the small, bright way childhood gives itself away before it learns caution. That evening, Clara set 3 plates on the table by mistake. Her hand stopped only after the 3rd plate was down. Samuel saw it. Wyatt, standing at the doorway with the pump leather he had replaced, saw it too. None of them spoke. Clara reached for the plate to put it back, but Samuel was quicker. He took it, set it at the far side of the table, and put a fork beside it with grave attention. Wyatt looked at the boy, then at the dark yard behind him. He did not step inside. Not yet. Instead, he placed the repaired leather on the shelf by the door and rested one hand on the frame. Clara covered the stew pot and lifted it from the stove. There was enough. There had been enough because she had made enough without admitting why. Wyatt removed his hat, brushed dust from the brim, and stood a moment longer, as if measuring whether a man known for leaving had any right to take a chair in a house still learning how not to feel abandoned. Then the bay gave a low sound from the cottonwood, and Samuel looked toward it with sudden worry. Wyatt set his hat back on, stepped down from the porch, and went to check the horse first. Clara watched him run his hand along the animal's neck, slow and patient, before tightening the rope that had begun to slip. He chose the need in front of him before the comfort offered. That was why, when he came back to the porch with mud on one boot and no explanation, Clara did not move the 3rd plate. Wyatt ate at the Bennett table that evening as if he had been invited to do ordinary work, not given a place where silence had sat too long. He washed at the pump first, scrubbing mud from his hands and wrists, then came in with his hat in one hand and stood until Clara nodded toward the 3rd chair. Samuel watched every movement. Boys who had lost men early learned to study the ones who remained near the door. Supper was stew, biscuits, and the last of the peach preserves from the cracked jar, scraped carefully into a small dish because waste was its own kind of grief. Wyatt took what was offered, not more. When Samuel reached for the preserves, then stopped as if remembering manners, Wyatt passed the dish to him first and went back to his stew. Clara saw that. Samuel saw it too. Afterward, Wyatt did not settle by the stove or stretch his legs like a man claiming comfort. He carried his plate to the basin, then took Samuel outside to show him how to wrap the pump handle before frost came hard enough to split what little they had. Clara cleared the table and listened through the open window. Wyatt's voice stayed low. He did not talk down to the boy. He showed him once, let Samuel try, corrected the rope with 2 fingers, and stepped back. By the end of it, Samuel had done the tying himself and stood a little taller beside the pump. The next days found a rhythm that nobody named. Wyatt came when work allowed. Clara did not wait at the window, but she kept coffee warm a little longer. Samuel stopped asking whether he thought Wyatt might come and began saving questions instead, how to read weather in a horse's ears, how deep to set a post, why the bay trusted the left side less than the right. Wyatt answered what had use. The rest he let be. The bay began taking carrot peelings from Clara every afternoon, then from Samuel, though only if the boy held still and remembered not to grab. Clara mended a split seam in Wyatt's saddle blanket after noticing the rub mark it left on the horse's back. She said nothing about it. He found it folded over the rail 2 mornings later, stitched tight with brown thread. His hand rested on the repair a moment before he saddled. Not long. Long enough. On Saturday, Dry Creek held a church social behind the meeting house, with pies on 2 planks set over barrels and children running between skirts and boots. Clara brought a bean dish because beans were what she had. She set it down beside Mrs. Alden's apple pies and felt, for a breath, the old awareness of being weighed and found plain. Then Samuel appeared carrying a small wooden box Wyatt had made from scrap cedar, fitted with a clean handle so Clara would not have to carry hot dishes wrapped in towels. He set it beside her bowl as if it had always belonged there. Wyatt stood at the far edge of the yard with the bay, away from the talk, one hand loose on the rein. Edward Pike looked from the box to Wyatt and said something Clara did not catch. She only saw Samuel's shoulders draw in. Wyatt saw it too. He did not cross the yard. He did not make a show. He led the bay to the fence near Samuel and placed the rein in the boy's hand for one careful minute, making Samuel the only child there trusted with the horse no one else could touch. The other boys came closer, quiet with envy. Samuel's shoulders settled. Clara looked at Wyatt then and understood that gentleness did not always look soft. Sometimes it looked like giving a boy his dignity back without anyone noticing the wound. The church social ended with dusk sitting low behind the cottonwoods and the road home turning blue at the edges. Samuel carried the cedar box against his chest all the way to the wagon, careful with it though it was empty now, while Clara folded the dish towel over her arm and kept her eyes on the ground where the grass had been flattened by boots. Wyatt did not follow close. He walked the bay beside the wagon until the meeting house lamps fell behind them, then rode on ahead to check the wash before Clara crossed it. That was how he was. He made a road safer, then let a person travel it with her own hands on the reins. Half a mile from the Bennett place, they found the problem waiting in the north pasture. The wind had pushed through the old cottonwood near the fence line and dropped a heavy limb across the wire. The milk cow stood on the wrong side of it, not far enough gone to be lost, but far enough to matter. Samuel climbed down before Clara could stop him, worry making him quick. Wyatt was already off his horse. He handed Samuel the lantern and pointed him toward the gate, away from the broken wire and the restless cow. No wasted motion. Clara tied the mare to the post, gathered her skirt above the mud, and took the fence pliers from the wagon box. Wyatt looked at her once. Not to question. To know where she was. They worked in the last of the light. Wyatt lifted the limb enough for Clara to pull the wire free. She twisted the broken strand back through the post, fingers aching as the metal bit cold through. Her gloves. Samuel held the lantern steady until his arm trembled, and when it dipped, he caught himself and raised it again. The cow shifted, nervous in the dark. The bay gave a low sound from the road, and the cow quieted at that more than any person could have managed. By the time the fence held, Clara's gloves were wet, Wyatt's shirt was dark across the shoulders, and Samuel had mud to his knees. No one had spoken more than needed. Then Samuel saw the bay standing loose where Wyatt had left him. The rope had slipped from the saddle horn and trailed in the grass. The horse had not run. It stood facing the Bennett porch, ears forward, as if the yard had become something it recognized. Clara saw Wyatt notice it. His hand went still on the fence rail. A man could hide many things while working. Not that. Clara went to the wagon, took the folded dish towel from the seat, and wiped the mud from Samuel's hands first. Then she crossed to the road and picked up the bay's rope. The horse let her. She led it to the barn, not the cottonwood, not the road post, but the barn, where dry hay waited and the door Wyatt had fixed swung true on its hinges. She did not ask permission. She opened the stall beside the mare and poured oats from their own bin, though there was not much to spare. Wyatt stood outside the lantern light, watching the choice settle into place. Clara came back to the porch, set the empty cedar box by the door, and carried 3 plates to the table before she took off her muddy gloves. This time, she did not pause over the third one. Wyatt did not leave after supper. He stepped outside with Samuel to settle the animals, then came back only long enough to take the lantern from the hook and check the barn latch Clara had closed behind the bay. The horse stood in the stall beside the mare, head low over the oats, rainwater drying in dark streaks along its neck. Wyatt rested one hand on the stall door and watched it eat. Clara stood a few steps behind him with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The barn smelled of hay, wet leather, and the small safety of animals breathing under a roof. Wyatt took the bay's rope from the peg, coiled it, and hung it beside the mare's bridle instead of carrying it back to his saddle. He did not look at Clara when he did it. He only made the choice visible. The next morning, Dry Creek made its own meaning of the horse in the Bennett barn. By noon, Edward Pike had ridden out with 2 men from town, not angry enough to be honest, only polite enough to be difficult. Clara met them at the porch with flour on her sleeves and Samuel just behind the screen door. Edward said folks were talking. He said a woman alone had to mind appearances. He said Wyatt Cain's name as if it were something she had been careless enough to spill on her own doorstep. Clara held the dish towel in both hands and let him finish. Before she could answer, the barn door opened. Wyatt came out carrying a broken harness strap he had been mending at the workbench. Samuel was beside him, holding the awl case. Wyatt crossed the yard, set the repaired strap on the porch rail, and stood at the bottom step. Not in front of Clara. Beside her. There was a difference. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He took his hat off because they were at her door, and then he looked at the south fence, the pump, the barn door, the porch step, all the places his hands had worked over the past weeks. Edward looked too, because there was no way not to. A man's presence could be argued with. His work was harder to dismiss. Samuel came out then and placed the awl case on the rail beside the strap, careful as a clerk setting down a record. Clara looked at the boy, then at Wyatt's hands, scraped and clean from washing, resting open at his sides. Edward found no decent words that did not make him smaller. He turned his horse first. The other men followed. When the road emptied, Wyatt picked up the dish towel Clara had dropped without noticing and laid it back over her arm. Then he went to the barn, brought out the bay, and led it not toward the road, but to the pasture gate he had repaired. He turned it loose beside the mare and closed the latch. Clara watched. The horse lowered its head to the grass as if it had been there all along, and for the first time, the whole yard seemed to take a breath. The afternoon after Edward Pike rode away, Wyatt stayed long enough to finish the harness strap and no longer. That was how trust kept its shape. It did not grab at what had just been given. It let the day breathe. Clara washed the supper bowls that evening while Samuel stood at the window and watched the pasture. The bay and the mare grazed shoulder to shoulder near the fence line, their heads bent into the same patch of grass. Samuel said the horse looked like it knew where it was now. Clara dried one bowl, set it on the shelf, and looked out at the fading light. The next morning, Wyatt came before breakfast with a small roll of leather, 2 horseshoe nails, and a sack of oats over one shoulder. He put the oats in the barn without asking where they belonged because by then he knew. Samuel came running out with his boots half buttoned, and Wyatt handed him the leather roll. Inside was a plain halter, stitched by hand, sized for the bay. Not fancy. Strong. Samuel carried it to Clara as if it were a letter. She ran her thumb over the stitches and recognized the thread from her own mending basket, left on the porch 3 nights before. Wyatt had used what was already in the house. That made it part of the house. By Sunday, the third chair no longer felt borrowed. Wyatt sat there after washing at the pump, Samuel on one side with a lesson book open beside his plate, Clara on the other cutting bread still warm from the stove. The bay stood outside the kitchen window, tied loose to the rail, wearing the new halter and flicking its ears at the sound of dishes. Clara set a heel of bread aside for later, then thought better of it and placed it on Wyatt's plate. He looked at it, then at her, and his hand rested around the coffee cup without lifting it. Nothing large passed between them. Only the quiet weight of being expected. After supper, Wyatt took the broken chair from the corner, the one Clara had meant to mend since winter, and turned it upside down by the stove. Samuel brought him nails before he asked. Clara held the lamp higher. The room gathered close around the work, firelight, coffee, drying dishes, the soft stamp of horses outside. When the chair stood firm again, Wyatt set it at the table instead of back in the corner. 4 chairs now. Clara looked at the place he had made, and Wyatt looked toward the window where the bay waited under the porch light, no longer pulling at the rope, no longer facing the road. Then he removed his hat and hung it on the peg by the door.